QR code, which you can find located on the screen at any given moment, or the QR code outside at the registration table. Okay, thank you. Excellencies, ambassadors, distinguished guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, and now it's time for our first sessions of the 16th South China Sea Conference hosted by the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. This session's title, Towards Multipolarity, Hot Peace, Cold War, or Peaceful Coexistence, will be moderated by His Excellencies Mr. Sandeep Arya, Indian Ambassador to Vietnam. So please welcome His Excellency's Ambassador on stage. And can I also have the honor to invite the speakers for sessions one to come on stage as well and join His Excellencies.
Good morning, Xin Chao. Welcome to all of you in this session on a very, very interesting subject. I'm pleased to also have such a distinguished panel representing, I think, the entire spectrum of perspectives on what has been called in the description as competitive visions and perspectives on the maritime domain in general. Dear friends, I think as the Deputy Minister, Mr. Do Hong Viet said, multipolarity is an unfolding reality that is shaping the world. There are three descriptions used here in terms of hot peace, cold war, or peaceful coexistence. But I think the broader international lexicon is also playing with words and looking at new combinations, and one of them is competitive coexistence, which I think is also a very interesting description. Some people also prefer to use the word hot coexistence, but there are, I think, the semantics aside, what we'll be looking at is really the various narratives, various views, various perspectives on the maritime domain in general. So I think I'll request my colleagues also to look at maybe three possible sub-themes of the entire subject. First is, I think, the description itself of the visions, perspectives, or narratives of emerging from respective, I think, countries and respective maybe regions or their own views on that. The second aspect or second dimension which we can touch upon is trying to analyze these perspectives and trying to see how do they align with global rules, global principles, global norms, and how is the relationship between them. And I think the third dimension, which will be even more interesting, is to look at how do we reconcile these narratives and how can we try to develop them so as to, become a means for enhancing cooperation and avoiding conflict and escalation in the maritime domain in the region and globally. So with that, I think I would like to invite the participants one by one. Each of you would have 10 minutes to basically present your views. I'll go from left to right in the order in which they are presented on the screen. So may I first invite Dr. Wu Shichun, the distinguished representative panel member from China. Stay here or go to the podium? Whatever you prefer. Staying here is okay.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would like to start my presenting by thanking the organizer to invite me to participate in this important conference. and also I'm happy to be included in this event. It is my third time to participate the South China Sea International Conference in person. Well, I'm going to look at the South China Sea issue by dividing my presentation into two parts. One is about current South China Sea issue. I'm going to only look at it from Chinese perspectives and in my personal capacity. And the second one is about how to promote peace and stability in the South China Sea, how to promote maritime cooperation in the South China Sea region. About the current South China Sea situation, my observations are, number one, the first issue is the US-led militarization of the South China Sea, which is currently the biggest threat to the security of the South China Sea. Let's just take a look at what US has done to promote the construction of a series of bilateral or multilateral security mechanisms. We will find that most of these mechanisms are aimed at China and are obviously confrontational and exclusive. If we look at this year's frequent military exercises in the nearby South China Sea region between the Philippines and the United States, and the recently multilateral military exercises which was held in Subic Bay in the South China Sea region, we can draw the conclusion I mentioned above. The second issue is the diversification of the unilateral actions by some claimant states in the South China Sea region. These unilateral actions in the disputed areas of South China Sea are with diverse, complex, and long-term means. There have been unilateral oil and gas exploitation, island construction, new attempts of physical control of uninhabited islands and reefs. The third issue is that the negative impact of the ruling on the South China Sea arbitration. Previously, in the last session, most of the speakers mentioned the arbitration award. The arbitration award, from my perspective, has emerged the negative impact of this award has emerged or has been revived. It has been proved that the South China Sea Arbitration Award has not brought peace and stability to the South China Sea. On the contrary, the award has been a troublemaker for the peace in the South China Sea and China-Philippine relations. Some people may say or may ask me that it is because China has not implemented the award. But I would like to ask these questions. How China can implement the award that totally rejects and denies the sovereignty, China's sovereignty and the rights in the South China Sea? Would China give up all its sovereignty and rights in the South China Sea? Or would it give up the Huangyan or Second Thomas Shore? Or would it just let the Philippines build military bases on the edge of Second Thomas Shore and do nothing? The second part I would like to address is about on how to maintain peace and stability in South China Sea and promote maritime cooperation in the South China Sea region. It is important to maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea and refrain from creating new disputes. As a matter of fact, even the status quo is maintained to the detriment of China and at the expense of China's interests in the South China Sea. Anyone who has little knowledge of history of the South China Sea will recognize the fact, which is that Nansha or Spratly and the Shisa or Parasol Islands were returned to China at the end of the World War II, and the Taiping Island or Ituaba and the Zhongyi Island or Situ Island were named after Chinese warships that accepted them at that time. Let me take a couple minutes to address you or brief the history of nine-dash line or U-shaped line or dashed line. Just in 1946, it was the then Chinese government, the ROC, took over the South China Sea Islands from Japan, because since 1939 to 1945, the South China Sea Islands was occupied by Japan. So soon after China received those islands from Japanese hand in 1947 to 1948, then Chinese government draw a dashed line map named as the administrative region of the Republic of China, and attached a small map, the locations of the South China Sea Islands. So then the dashed line map came out. And because of the new China inherited the 11 dashed line since its founding of the People's Republic of China. In 1953, because of the good relationship between China and Vietnam, China decided to remove the 2 dashes in the Bamboo Bay of the Gulf of Tonkin. So since then, the 11 dash line became 9 dash line. So that's where the 9 dash line came from. So today's disputes over the South China Sea were triggered in 1970s by the littoral countries' occupation of some islands and reefs, the Nansha Islands, which had already belonged to China. The second one, demilitarization is also helpful for the peace and the stability of the South China Sea. Extra-regional countries should refrain from holding military exercises and joint patrols in the disputed areas, and from building military facilities, deploying military forces in surrounding countries of the South China Sea that target at a certain party. Regional countries should be cautious about military cooperation that may affect the peace and the stability of the South China Sea and target third parties. And they should also think twice about allowing extra-regional countries to build military bases and deploy military forces in the South China Sea region, which may lead to an arms race. The third one, the claimed countries needed to refrain from taking new attempts over uninhabited islands and reefs, from changing the status quo of islands and reefs already under their control, and from building new military installations on the islands and reefs they occupied. The first one, countries needed to start genuine and meaningful maritime cooperation in the areas where consensus can be reached. Follow the principle of specific fields, long period of time, bilateralism first. For example, we should start with the survey of fishery resources and the joint fishery law enforcement and the protection of marine environment under the DOC framework. In this regard, I think China and Vietnam can and should take the leader. I often ask myself, Ambassador Tingui is here, why can't China and Vietnam, as good neighbors and good friends who are comrades and brothers, make some attempts and breakthroughs in properly handling the South China Sea issue and controlling the South China Sea differences between China and Vietnam, and promote maritime cooperation between China and Vietnam in the South China Sea region. Because we have good successful lessons to learn from. It is the demarcation in the Bamboo Bay of Gulf Tonkin. I was deeply involved in 1990s in the demarcation negotiations, both at the governmental level and scholar level. So, in conclusion, all parties, in my opinion, needed to lower the overly ambitious, the Secretary General from ASEAN, from Indonesia, just mentioned he's optimistic about the COC negotiation. What I'm going to say is we needed to lower the overly ambitious and unrealistic expectation of the COC negotiation. We need to position or even slim it down as the confidence building measures and the crisis management measures. It would be unrealistic, and delay the consultation of the COC if attempts are made to all encompassing or including everything, and to achieve breakthroughs in the area that are difficult to reach. I would stop there. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you, Professor Wu Shichun, for laying out Chinese perspective on the South China Sea and also your ideas about promoting maritime cooperation in the area. May I now invite Mr. Derek Grossman to make his presentation. I think Professor Fyodor Lukyanov is not yet connected and will wait, maybe connect to him later.
Okay.
Dr. Grossman.
All right. Good morning, everyone. And I want to first thank DAV and all the sponsors of this event for the kind invitation to speak with you all today. And so the remarks I'm going to make are going to appear in a forthcoming paper published by DAV on the emerging multipolar world order and its impact on the South China Sea. So the emerging multipolar world order holds significant consequences for the future maintenance of global peace and stability. And this is especially true in regions that are already hotly contested by great powers, such as China, Russia, and the United States, and other emerging power centers with a stake in the outcome of these rivalries. In the South China Sea, the dominant strategic competitors are China and the United States, but increasingly American allies and partners are playing an important role as well, to include Australia, India, Japan, South Korea, and then multilateral organizations like ASEAN and the EU, as we heard earlier today, and the UK. With their support, nations at the forefront of Beijing's rising assertiveness in the South China Sea, namely the Philippines and Vietnam, have the unique and strategic opportunity to enhance deterrence against China. However, there is an equally strong possibility that the additional support creates the conditions for a new escalatory dynamic that could lead to miscalculation and ultimately crisis or even war. Before turning to how Southeast Asian countries might be impacted by intensifying U.S.-China competition in the South China Sea, let me first address the competing narratives between China and the U.S. China claims sovereignty over approximately 90% of the South China Sea, which encompasses the Paracel Islands, Spratly Islands, Dongsha/Pratas Islands, Scarborough Shoal, and all of the seas in between. And this is done through its so-called 9-dash line, which the professor was just talking about. Although it is a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which guarantees all coastal nations an exclusive economic zone of 200 nautical miles from their shores, Beijing's claims are in clear contravention of both the letter and spirit of this accord. Rather than basing its claims on international law and norms of behavior as codified by UNCLOS, China has decided to premise its 9-dash line on historical territorial rights. Indeed, Chinese leader Xi Jinping, as part of his plan to rejuvenate the Chinese nation after a century of humiliation, is literally dusting off maps from the Ming and Qing dynasties, that's hundreds of years ago, to prove that Chinese fishermen had traditionally fished these same waters. The problem is that such an expansive claim overlaps with the legally demarcated EEZs of Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. It also overlaps with Indonesia's EEZ, depending where exactly Beijing places the southernmost dash of its claims. By contrast, the United States is trying to keep the entire Indo-Pacific, in its words, free and open from coercive activities, and this is perhaps most prominently playing out in the South China Sea. While former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden disagree on most things, they have mostly been in sync on the Indo-Pacific. Indeed, the Indo-Pacific strategies of each administration have been far more similar than dissimilar, with the basic objectives being to empower U.S. allies and partners to counter China to prevent Beijing's attempts to compromise the integrity of EEZs and other international waterways, such as the Taiwan Strait. Of course, part of the narrative problem for Washington is that while it's a signatory to UNCLOS, it's also embarrassingly yet to ratify UNCLOS, opening the door to Chinese claims of hypocrisy. Nevertheless, the U.S. continues to operate in the spirit of UNCLOS, which has brought it into further alignment with not only international law and norms of behavior, but also the policies of maritime counterclaimants in Southeast Asia. Beyond China and the United States, there are several other powerful countries that are increasingly playing a role in the South China Sea. Australia, for instance, has firmly aligned itself with the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. India is a key emerging strategic partner of the United States, and as such, Washington welcomes its deepening presence and activities in the South China Sea. Meanwhile, the U.S.-Japan security alliance is historically strong and robust, to include collaboration in the South China Sea. Another U.S. security ally in Northeast Asia, South Korea, is perhaps unexpectedly playing a role in the South China Sea as well, as President Yoon Suk-yeol's recent visit to the Philippines underscored. Although intensifying U.S.-China competition to achieve a regional order in the South China Sea is worrisome, not all is lost for maritime counterclaimants in the region. Indeed, rivalry offers several strategic opportunities. One of them is clearly that supporters of UNCLOS are now more enthusiastic about backing Southeast Asian maritime counterclaimants, meaning countries like the Philippines and Vietnam have and will continue to benefit from additional security cooperation and the collective diplomatic and economic heft of the United States and its allies and partners external to the region. Another opportunity is that rather than choosing to purely balance against Beijing, they could instead choose to hedge. If calibrated properly, hedging can allow nations to maximize benefits from both China and the United States. Although opportunities may arise from intensifying U.S.-China rivalry in the South China Sea, there are likely to be significant challenges as well. The U.S. and its allies and partners are working in concert to counter Beijing in the region, and though this is not equal to an Asian NATO or anything of the sort, and I know that's been talked about a lot lately with the new Japanese Prime Minister, it does not begin to approach bloc geopolitics. China routinely rails against Washington for having a quote-unquote zero-sum or a quote-unquote Cold War mentality. And Beijing uses this narrative as justification not only to enhance its own military capabilities, to break out of US-led containment, in their words, but also as evidence to persuade other countries of America's malign intent. Hence, it's conceivable that China would respond by establishing its own bloc to counter the US-led bloc, further heightening tensions in the South China Sea. Beijing might do this by calling upon another great power, Russia, to play more of a role in the South China Sea. To be sure, Moscow has little to no interest in the region, but it may feel compelled to support Chinese objectives there since Beijing has quite publicly and secretly supported the Kremlin's war effort in Ukraine. China might further enlist countries within Southeast Asia, like Cambodia, where it now has Navy ships deployed at Ream Naval Base, to support its narrative and to step up patrolling of the region. Increased rivalry among great powers presents the challenge of war avoidance as well. If tensions were to escalate to crisis or war, then Southeast Asian maritime counterclaimants will no longer benefit from rivalry and would probably have to choose China or the United States to ensure their own interests and values are met in the future. This would be problematic for them, as they would be forced to compromise and potentially incur costs that otherwise could have or should have been avoided. So going forward, and I have a lot more policy recommendations in my paper, but in the interest of time, I'll just say going forward, it's going to be vital for both the United States and China to tone down their competition, not just in the South China Sea, but globally. And maritime counterclaimants in Southeast Asia, such as, or namely, the Philippines and Vietnam, should ensure that their policies and activities reinforce peace and stability rather than unnecessarily inflaming what is already a potentially highly combustible situation. So I'm going to yield the rest of my time in the interest of getting some really good Q&A and back and forth on the panel, and over to my good friend and colleague, Dewi. Or back to you, sir, first.
Thank you, Mr. Grossman, for laying out what US perspective as well as what you call competing narratives on the region and possible perspectives and possible suggestions or ideas also in terms of toning down competition. I'm sure, I think we'll have the audience respond to some of those ideas. Maybe now move on to Professor Devi Fortuna Anwar from Indonesia to share her views. 10 minutes of presentation, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege for me here to share the stage with an Indian moderator and panelists from China, the United States, and Russia, and Indonesia representing ASEAN here. So it's a great honor for me to be here. I have a PowerPoint presentations, and no longer in government, I'm mostly an academic. I can take a more academic perspectives in the discussion. So first, I begin by actually addressing the title of this panel, Towards Multipolarity, Hot Peace, Cold War, or Peaceful Coexistence. So my first question is, are we talking about multipolarity, or in fact, we are talking about multiplexity? So we talk about the Cold War, where the two ideological blocks was characterized by real bipolarity. And then a brief period of the immediate post-Cold War of the United States being the only superpower, we have unipolarity. And now with the emergence of so many new centers of power, with the emergence of China, India, and resurgence of Russia, and so many others, major powers, people begin to talk about multipolarity, particularly in the diplomatic circles, government circles. But academics tend to be much more pedantic about this. So the question is whether it is really multipolarity or multiplexity. And Professor Amitav Archaya has introduced the concept of multiplexity. So next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So what is a multiplex world order? When we think about multipolarity, we think about pre-World War I or pre-World War II Europe or the international system, where there were present several major powers of more or less equal weights. You have several Western European powers. In pre-World War II, you have Japan, you have the United States, you have Russia. None of them were superpowers, yet more or less the same weight. So when you talk about multipolarity, you're mostly talking about apples to apples. But in today's world, what we have is very, very complex international dynamics, where there are varied international actors and also no longer just dominated by a handful of major powers. When we look at actors, we have two superpowers now. China, the United States and China are well above the others. They are the real superpowers. The Lowy Power Index clearly put them, they're the two superpowers above 70 ranks, the measurements. And then we have major powers. We have like India, like Japan, like Russia, which are not superpowers, but they are bigger than the middle powers. Major powers are also playing a very active role. And then middle powers. In the old international system, countries like Indonesia, Australia, Canada were probably not really active players, or South Korea. But now the middle powers are also playing a very important role in international politics. And then, what about regional organizations? We have listened to the presentation about the EU. Regional organizations in Europe plays a very critical role in establishing peace and stability and economic development. And ASEAN, no matter how small and weak we are, ASEAN has been the most important actor in establishing a regional architecture. So you cannot simply just ignore a regional organization, and it is not a single actor, it's regional organizations. And of course you have non-state actors. We don't have time here to talk about it. But only until recently, the most significant actors were terrorist organizations. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, we seem to have forgotten them. But for a while, these were the most significant players in international politics that determine the international system. And then, of course, there are more diverse issues. We are not just talking about traditional security issues, but we also talk about non-traditional security issues. And again, various contending narratives. So I'm involved in a project now about multiplexity of our international system. Next, please. Contending perspectives. Now, multiplexity is also about contending perspectives. We have talked about, briefly in my paper, being an academic paper mostly, I talk about liberal international order, which is the most dominant system that we have enjoyed or endured since the end of Second World War, but there are challenges. What are the liberal international orders? Of course, support for international laws, support for multilateralism, multipolarity. Also, there's liberal values there, democracy and human rights. But the most important thing is rule-based international order. International law is very much key to this. And this, of course, is under challenges. We have UNCLOS as the main issue here. UNCLOS has been the most significant international law. But there are contending perspectives. We have listened about China is a party to UNCLOS, but it has irredentist claims using historical and traditional rights. So it is a party, but it violates a lot of the spirits and the letters of UNCLOS. And then you have another contending perspective, the free and open Indo-Pacific by the US, Japan, and a number of similar-minded countries. Here there is a problem. The US supports international law, but it has still not ratified UNCLOS. So that actually, how can you say that you are a champion of international law when the US has still refused to fight UNCLOS? This is also undermining the strength of international law here. And of course, and then you have the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. It's not an ASEAN strategy, which focuses on ASEAN norms and values and code of conduct. The central to this is the TAC, a Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia, which is Pacific settlements of disputes, non-use of force, and so on. Now, very quickly, I'd like to go to the final page. They are hot peace, Cold War, or peaceful coexistence. Now, is it hot peace? Well, it is clearly not war yet, but the South China Sea is bubbling. The problem here is that we do not have direct military confrontations, but as been mentioned a number of times, China is increasingly using gray zone tactics. And here we have to look at the weaponization of the Coast Guards. So it is not military clashes, but Coast Guards is becoming the major actors, where increasingly, we are not open war. I think that there's China and the United States and the Philippines are careful not to go that way. But if there is no management of this, hot peace could become, just very, very hot and not terribly peaceful. What about the Cold War? Now, we don't have time to talk about whether this is a Cold War or not a Cold War, but I see there is increasing bipolarity within our multiplex world. There is, in the economic and technology field, for example, there's increasing de-risking and decoupling from the US sides, and also tit for tat, also increasingly from China. Now there's also this value-based approach. Free and open Indo-Pacific is not just about spatial, free and open, free navigation or free offer flight, but also we're talking about values, liberal values, democracy, freedom, and so on. So there is an increasingly also the value-based discourse in the free and open Indo-Pacific, which China regards as constraining China, as being aimed against China. So is that an emerging Cold War? We can debate about that. You know, as many scholars, we can debate with ourselves about that. And then, so what is the choice? And here, you know, for ASEAN, has been reiterated over and over again, ASEAN wants to stress its strategic autonomy, not taking sides in the US-China rivalry. There's non-alignment, but our non-alignment is very different from the non-alignment during the Cold War. Non-alignment during the Cold War is we kept aloof. We tried not to be involved, to try to keep a distance. Our non-alignment now is actually multi-engagement. ASEAN countries, ASEAN are engaging with all sides. And when it comes to US and China, I've written about this, you know, all countries, regarding whether they're allied to the United States or whether they're closer to China or truly free and active like Indonesia, we are all hedging. So we try to benefit from all sides because both China and the United States are important partners at the bilateral level and also important partners at ASEAN level. So we all try to benefit from what we can get, but also mitigate risk. And for this, I think that, you know, we will talk more about this. The most important thing for us is really to ensure peaceful coexistence through ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. The issue is not about how to resolve who owns what, but how to manage the potential conflicts from becoming open conflicts. So the early conclusion of the COC, but it has to be based on UNCLOS, on international law. We do not want to see an early conclusion of COC which is based on asymmetrical power coercion. We do not want China to force ASEAN to accept a COC which actually compromise the integrity of UNCLOS. So, and I said, you know, for ASEAN, this is non-negotiable for us. And ASEAN is not just a passive pawn, because when we're talking about big power competition, Southeast Asia has always been the theater, and ASEAN does not want to do that. So the most important thing is ASEAN strategic autonomy, ASEAN centrality, and ASEAN agency. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Devi. I think you covered the entire range of issues from the categorization of power to contending perspectives. You looked at a little bit of, I think, their consistency with UNCLOS, etc. And I think AOIP itself and the code of conduct as a way forward. Dear colleagues, I think we do not have the Russian speaker online, but I think the presentations made by the three panelists who are present here, I think were fairly comprehensive. It was interesting to look at, you know, laying out of the vision or perspectives by, or the narrative from three, I think, very interesting approaches to the whole subject. And I think it is, some of you also, the panelists try to touch upon in terms of, you know, how do these narratives or perspectives from three different way of looking at things, how do they align with the rules and principles or what you call the rules-based order, and also the issue of how do we reconcile them, you know, what is the way forward. And I think it was interesting to hear some degree of similarity in terms of the panelists talking about restraint, about toning down of competition, and also about maybe code of conduct as a way forward, etc. So I think the floor is wide open in terms of, you know, your reactions, your questions, etc. And I'm sure members of the panel will look forward to questions. So we can try to look at the room, the hall here, and then maybe move on to the online questions also. So we have, I think, 2 questions from the second row here. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you to all of the panelists. My question was to Dr. Wu. You mentioned, Dr. Wu, in passing, a reference to the arbitral award, stating that it had rejected China's claims of sovereignty. If I understood you correctly, I would take issue with that assertion, because my understanding is that it did not tackle sovereignty because it was not qualified to do so, and the judges approached it in that spirit. Rather, what it did was reach a verdict that the features that were claimed were not capable of generating jurisdiction, which is a very different thing. It did not reject China's sovereignty claims. In fact, in the case of Scarborough Shoal, for example, it actually recognized that there was a Chinese claim to the feature, but rather that feature is within the bounds of a territorial sea, and it suggested provisional measures under which China and the other co-claimant could enter into arrangements. So I would just press for your qualification and response on that point, please.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Taufan from Indonesia. Thank you very much for all the presentations. My question will go to Mr. Derek Grossman. We've heard some observation from other two panelists on the COC. So I'm like to seek your comments on the COC itself from, let's say, the U.S. Or geopolitical perspective. Where do you think how U.S. or other, you mentioned several states which, let's say, place outside of the region itself, and then what do you think on this issue, how they approach the COC itself, where I see there are 2 points on the COC itself, the process itself, the negotiation, as well as the substance itself. I mean, do you think the process of the negotiation of the COC itself will be helpful, or it will be going nowhere, or the content itself? And then whether you see any approach from the U.S. government or other relevant agencies towards China, because the ASEAN member states, we've heard some U.S. approach or some meeting on this, just to know the development. Thank you so much.
So I see 2 more raised hands, maybe several more. We'll try to take 2 questions from there and 1 online questions, and those 5 questions we'll try to answer before we move to the next round. So would you like to?
I've got a follow-up question. Oh, I'm Leszek Buszyński from Australia. I've got a follow-up question to Dr. Wu Shikun, and your passing reference to the 2016 arbitral tribunal decision, which, okay, a follow-up question for you relating to your diplomatic reference to the 2016 arbitral tribunal decision, which you skirted. And do you not realize that this has been regarded as a challenge to international order? China has made enemies as a consequence, and this has brought in outside powers into the region, of which people like you complain bitterly. My country, Australia, Japan, now South Korea, let alone the US and the EU. We discussed the EU previously. And these are all countries that are very committed to upholding international law and international order. And China seems to be oblivious of that and engages in the blame game, blaming the United States for everything, which I think is a little distorted. So would you like to react to that? It seems to me, looking at what China says, that China doesn't seem to realize the consequences of its own actions, of which it complains bitterly.
Thank you very much. We'll try to take 1 question from this side also. Yeah, the second row, please.
I'm Renato from the Philippines. I would like to address my question to Dr. Wu. Dr. Wu, when you mentioned about the factors that are complicating the South China Sea issue, you mentioned about the military activities that are being conducted by the Philippines and its treaty ally with the United States. But you have to understand, we are treaty allies even before you have the emergence of China. We've been the treaty allies since 1951, and all the activities that we are conducting, including, of course, the deployment of the Typhoon missiles in the Philippines, are inside Philippine territory. In a way, if you talk about the notion of sovereignty, it is none of your business, it's our business. Those actions are done within Philippine territory. Do you think by criticizing this, China is basically violating an important aspect of the international norm? That is, of course, respect for sovereignty and territoriality. So in a way, it seems that China is treating the Philippines like a tributary kingdom, which of course would complicate the situation. I would like to ask your comment regarding this matter.
Thank you very much. I think rest of the questions we'll take in the second round. I'll take one question from the online participants. The first question I'll read it out for the benefit of all of you. The question is, how does multipolarity and the rule-based international order coexist? Whose rules are we talking about? So I think that seems to be an open question, and I think I'll invite all of you to take that question. Dr. Wu, I think you have the more number of questions. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. I got to address to three questions. Two are related to the arbitration ruling. With regard to the arbitration ruling, first, Mr. You from which country? Sorry.
Sorry, Dr. Ewan Graham from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute.
Okay, from my friend from Australia. Actually, the arbitration award, it is indirectly related to the sovereignty. If we look at the arbitration award, in my opinion, if the tribunal has been impartial or objective, it could be decided that the Hualien Island and the Second Thomas Shore are within the Philippine EEZ. So, in this sense, I said the arbitral tribunal indirectly deal with the sovereignty. Because China's, South China Sea issue are related to only two questions. One is the question about territorial title over lands, I mean islands or reefs or coasts, and another one is maritime entitles in the South China Sea region. So the tribunal indirectly deal with the sovereignty issue. Another question about the tribunal's award. I think the award, the tribunal arbitration award, has nothing to do with the international law or international rule. If we look at the backgrounds, from my personal perspective, I was deeply involved in the whole process of track 2 dialogue, negotiation, and workshops on the whole process of the arbitral tribunal. So, Chinese official stance is 3 no's: no acceptance, no participation, and no recognition of the ruling. So it is not about interpretation or application of the UNCLOS. It is about the sovereignty. The essence or substantive issues between China and the Philippines is about the sovereignty, because the Philippines, since the 1970s, through 5 military actions, occupied those islands. If the Second Thomas Shore was included, 9 reefs or islands. So it is actually about the sovereignty. That is why China, decided not to participate. It is about the sovereignty issue, cannot or beyond the UNCLOS. Your question about missile deployment in the Philippines. Yes, you're right. It's your sovereignty to decide whether to receive the U.S. missile capability or facilities deployed in the Philippines soil. But I would say, is it conducive to the peace and the stability? to the South China Sea? Is it conducive to the peace and stability across Taiwan Strait? Is it good for our bilateral relation between China and the Philippines? So China is against, I think, there was, from those perspectives, regional peace and stability. It will absolutely lead to the armed force. If the United States eventually decided to deploy missile facilities in the Philippines, that is my answer to your question. Thank you, my friend.
Yeah, Mr. Crossman.
All right. Well, so you see what Dr. Wu just did there, okay? With all due respect, right? So what you're doing in the Philippines by deploying that system, that's somehow the Philippines' fault. But China has a claim that's 90% of the South China Sea based on historical territorial rights. With all due respect, I mean, there's action, reaction. Now, we could have, I think, a very fruitful debate about whether doing that deployment actually makes sense to maintain peace and stability. But to kind of point the finger back, that's actually part and parcel of the problem here, okay? And I think we're seeing it play out in real time. To answer the question on the screen here, how does multipolarity and the rules-based international order coexist? Whose rules? I think multipolarity and rules-based order can certainly coexist. If you listen to my remarks, I said that the US and its allies and partners, and I just named a few of them, there are many more, okay, they all agree that we need to maintain a rules-based international order. The issue is that there are certain countries who claim that they want a rules-based order, but are operating in a way and are doing things in a way that the United States considers to be revisionist, all right? Go back to the Trump administration's national security strategy. They labeled countries like China and Russia as revisionist countries. If you look at more recently, Secretary of State Tony Blinken's article in Foreign Affairs, the November-December issue, he talks about how we don't want an axis of grievance, or I forget what he said, but it was an axis of, it's not the axis of resistance, but it's like the axis of grievance, right? China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea all working together, right, because they feel aggrieved by the international order. We don't want that. We want to be able to engage with those countries in a productive way. But the fact of the matter is, in the last few years, I mean, especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, I mean, the rules-based order is on the verge of being shattered right now. I'm not going to sit here and say that the United States is perfect either. We're certainly not a saint in any of this, right? We have done things in the past that I think also have violated the rules-based international order. Look no further than us going to war in Iraq in 2003 against the United Nations vote not to do that, right? You could look at our use of drones, drone strikes, right, to conduct killings abroad, all right, which I think is a clear violation of international law and norms of behavior. Okay, so we are not innocent in this as well, but I believe that we at least try to explain that we're looking toward the future and we're going to try to behave better. But I don't think that we see that from the Chinas and the Russias of the world, to be honest, especially in the South, well, China specific to the South China Sea. On the code of conduct process, I'm just going to be blunt about this. I think that I'm always somebody who promotes dialogue and diplomacy, and I'll always stand up for it, even when it seems to be going nowhere. But let's be honest about the code of conduct. It's been going on now, I believe, for over 30 years. Right? Well, the legally binding code of conduct, if we date back prior to the declaration of conduct, there were negotiations even before that. So I mean, it depends where we started. Okay, but you would have to look at something like, Israel-Palestinian negotiations, right, or Israel or Arab negotiations, to find a period of diplomatic negotiations that has gone on longer than the code of conduct. And now we're hearing that the new, legally binding code of conduct maybe by 2026, that's the deadline, right? But that's been postponed several times already. All right, so my personal view on it is that China does not want a legally binding code of conduct, and it is exploiting previously existing fissures within ASEAN, right? So countries like Cambodia and Laos are not nearly as interested in the South China Sea, and they're also getting Belt and Road Initiative money, right? So there's no reason for them to speak out in favor of the Philippines and Vietnam and the other counterclaimants, right? China knows this, and so why not support countries who don't support getting to that legally binding code of conduct? Some of the things that have been leaked out of the negotiations, we saw things like, Vietnam, I think it was Vietnam, did not want China to declare a South China Sea ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone, no militarization of new features, things like that. Those things don't exactly benefit China, honestly, right? And lawlessness, right, no legally binding code of conduct is actually preferred over having something that they would have to adhere to. So in my view, I don't really see it happening anytime soon, if ever.
Thank you very much. Professor Devi.
Okay, I think that we have been challenged by our American friends. So ASEAN really need to step up to show that there is an ASEAN unity and cohesion, and that we are serious. But actually, the real negotiation only started. The DOC was signed in 2002, and the terms of reference for the DOC was only agreed upon in 2011. And the code of conduct, the negotiation only started, 6 or 7 years ago. So it's not that long there. Yeah. So we make haste slowly, but hopefully we'll get there eventually. I'd like to address the two questions. First on multipolarity and whose rules, and then there's another one. What strategies developing nations should adopt in the normative contestation between power centers in the South China Sea?
We'll move to these other questions later.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Doing
No,
that
no,
first
because
question.
because it links, yeah.
Yeah.
So when we are talking about rules, all the international laws are negotiated by sovereign states. So no sovereign states are coerced to agree on anything. So when we talk about international laws, it means that all the countries that took part in the negotiations, that is the rules that we agree upon. But of course, there are lawyers. Even in the national law, we have lawyers fighting about particular interpretation of the law. But the most important thing is about that, we agree that our base point is the same law, so that we do not have different laws where China uses historical claims while the rest of the world uses UNCLOS. Clearly this is not going to work. But here the most important thing for us, I think that for us, UNCLOS, for Indonesia, for the Philippines, and for countries, archipelagic states, our very existence is defined, our territories are defined by UNCLOS. So for us, this is something that is very basic to our existence. And I think that we may disagree on interpretation, but I think we have to start from the same laws. Now here, how do we ensure the integrity of the laws? And Derek has already mentioned that there should be no exceptionalism. So when international laws are openly violated in one part of the world, like in Gaza, it weakens the integrity of international law. Big powers shoot themselves in the foot when they say, you have to maintain and uphold international laws in the South China Sea, but you're not doing it in the Middle East, or then you're not doing it in Eastern Europe. So it has to be absolutely, you cannot have different interpretations. So in this case, what we, developing countries, Global South, are calling on all of the big powers to ensure that, that you have to be consistent. So consistency in applications of international laws are critical to the respect of international laws. And I think that's my point.
May I have quick response?
Yeah, once again. Would you like to also cover, there was a question on the code of conduct and role of external powers or something. If you would like to, it is okay, otherwise we'll move on.
Yeah. For us, the COC is clearly between ASEAN and China. But we in ASEAN believe in an inclusive regional architecture. We believe in the rights of all parties to give us inputs, and they have rights in terms of freedom of navigations and overflight and so on. And clearly their concerns about the rights of passage and international seas need to be respected. We do not want to see a conduct on the South China Sea would, for example, exclude legitimate uses of the seas. by all the other international stakeholders in the region. I think this is what we must have to ensure.
Dr. Wu, you wanted to respond.
Thank you, Ambassador. I needed to make a quick response to remarks by Mr. Grossman. The definition of 90% China claims in the South China Sea. Otherwise, there will be a bigger misunderstanding about what China claims in the South China Sea. Geographically speaking, the South China Sea is a semi-enclosed sea in the Western Pacific. The size is about 3.5 million square kilometers. According to your logic, China claims near about 3 million square kilometers of South China Sea. It's not true. It's not a story. With regard to what claimed in the South China Sea dash line, China only claims the sovereignty over 4 islands or archipelago islands, Dongsha, Xisha, Zhongsha, and Nansha, and adjacent waters. China has a sovereignty. And the jurisdiction over disputed waters, depends on negotiation through bilateral diplomatic approach. So China never claims the South China Sea as its sovereignty or territorial sea. With regard to the COC, it's important because there are lots of concerns about COC. I'm personally not so optimistic about the COC. Why? When China, ASEAN, 10 ASEAN countries, come to the nature of the COC, the upcoming COC should have legal binding or not. If we come to geographical scope, if we come to the relationship between the DOC, Professor Anwar just mentioned DOC and the COC, and also the third parties, United States, Japan, even India, what their interests in the South China Sea, and also on how to implement the COC once it is in place. There will be differences and disagreements between China, even among ASEAN countries themselves. That's why I'm personally not so optimistic about the future consultation and negotiation on the COC. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are running short of time, so please try to be brief and we'll try to cover as many questions as possible. So we can start from there. The third row first.
Sorry, I have a microphone here, sorry. Thank you, Chair. Congratulations to all the speakers, very wonderful. Hot peace, Cold War, peaceful coexistence. Peaceful coexistence is not existing at this panel, I feel, from the debate, but let me congratulate everyone. Professor Wu, thank you for the 3 points you make, but I would say this. This should not come to a surprise to China. Our friend from Philippines already made some point with the U.S. led militarizing of the South China Sea. The U.S. will go on, and our friend from Iran explained already the Indo-Pacific strategy. The U.S. led will continue to operate where international boundary allow them to do so. So having COC, not having COC, I'm not so sure that you have any effects on the U.S. So you should know, China should know that. So I think by knowing it, you will recalibrate your position with regard to the COC. Now, the COC, let me ask my good friend, Professor Devi, you want UNCLOS to configure in there, and you hear Professor Wu low down the expectation. The COC is supposed to be the managing of tension, not to solve sovereignty issues. You think that you can get COC binding at that level? So if that's not a point, why in the DOC you put one clause that you will do the COC? This is a shortfall of the ASEAN, who doesn't really project itself. You play with something, or you're undertaking something that you cannot deliver. So when is the time that ASEAN and China sit down together and say, let's agree to do something that both sides would benefit the most, but not disturbing everybody else? And Mr. From Rand, multipolar world agree, but it will be defined by U.S. and China, by these two main guys. Can you let me know what role U.S. will play in the South China Sea should there will be tension and then flare up into conflicts? Thank you.
Row number 5 there, the lady in the corner.
Sorry? Okay, thank you. Good evening, panel. So I'm a researcher from the Diplomatic Academy Vietnam, and I want to engage with the speech of Dr. Wu. So I think one of the underlying issue regarding the South China Sea dispute is that everybody has their own justification, and we hold on to it. So, and it's totally understandable. So I think one of the things we should do is to frankly discuss and compare the evidence. And for example, Vietnam has sufficient evidence and legal basis to assert that it has maintained effective and continuous administration of both the Paracel and Spratly Islands since at least the 17th century. So what is your opinion of the prospect of taking the issue into the court if every country just keep asserting on their own justification? That's the first question. Regarding the second question, I want to engage a bit before jumping to the question. So firstly, the first dashed line map predates the existence of the People's Republic of China, having been published in 1947 by the Republic of China, and it did not declare any sovereignty or claims by the People's Republic of China. And also at that time, the UNCLOS did not come into effective for any, so it cannot give any justification on that map, even like when we go back to history, right? And thirdly, in 2009, the Chinese government communicated 2 notes to the UN Secretary General, stated that China has indisputable sovereignty over the island in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters, and enjoys sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters and seabed and subsoil thereof. But China has not clarified through legislation, proclamation, or other official statement and legal basis on the nature of the claims associated with the dashed line, and did not explain clearly the limitation or boundary of what is the adjacent water or relevant water, even though UNCLOS came into effect at that time already. So how do you explain it? So those are my 2 questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. In the center, 5th row, the 2 of them, the ladies.
Thank you, moderator. My name is Huang Ziqi, and I come from the Taiwan Economic and Culture Office in Vietnam. So we would like to answer to some remarks made by Professor Wu regarding some historical facts of the Republic of China, which is Taiwan, after World War II. So first of all, we'd like to stress that Republic of China, Taiwan, and the PRC China are not subordinate to each other and do not represent each other. So this being said, we will also stress that Itu Aba, or Taiping Island, is being managed by the government of Taiwan and not by the government of China in the spirit of peace and sustainability. We would also like to reiterate our claims to rights over the South China Sea islands in accordance to international law and the law of the sea. But this being said, Taiwan recognizes the highly complex nature of the issues on the South China Sea, and we stress above all the importance that all parties exercise self-restraint to preserve regional peace and stability and international law, and we refrain from any kind of action that complicates the issue, that heighten actions, and we strongly condemn such kind of actions, such as those taken by the Chinese law enforcement on September 29 on the fishermen of Japan. We condemn and we do not support such actions. And we'd like to stress that Taiwan is willing and ready to work with all parties to solve this issue through peaceful dialogues and to uphold regional peace, stability, and the international liberal order. Thank you.
Quickly, please. Do you have a question? No? Okay. Anybody here? So row number 6, row number 7. Please be brief so that we get more time for the response.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I'm Matheus Bruno. I'm from Brazil, here thanks to the Young Leaders Program. I have a question for Professor Dewey Fortuna. One of your last statements was really interesting, that when it comes to the big power competition, Southeast Asia have always been the theater. So during your presentation, you made other really good observation that things have changed and the dynamic is different than the one faced by the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. And we can talk also about ASEAN during the same period, since this organization was also being inspired by the former. So the ASEAN way also have a great use during the primary decades of the organization, but I would like to know from you, how do you see the use of the ASEAN way today? Is it enough? How does it impact ASEAN's diplomatic capacity nowadays? And maybe it is time for a new reinvention in the institutional dynamic of ASEAN, given the new dynamic of multi-complexity that you mentioned. Thank you.
Last 2 questions. Anybody? Yeah.
So I have 2 questions. The first one would be directed to Mr. Grossman. He mentioned that both sides, China and the US, should tone down regionally and globally. So my question is, how can that be achieved? And the second question would be towards Professor Anwar. You mentioned that UNCLOS being the non-negotiable aspect for ASEAN for the negotiation for the COC. So my question is, how can ASEAN reconcile the non-negotiable factor of UNCLOS with China's perhaps unwillingness to complete the COC and would rather delay the completion? Thank you.
Last question, second row. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Jean Chan, RSI Singapore. Question for Dr. Wu. Sir, you suggested that to speed up the process for the COC negotiation, all parties need to lower expectations. Appreciate if you can actually elaborate a little bit more. What are some of these elements that are indeed overly ambitious and which are actually totally unrealistic, that's not open for negotiation at all to China? Thank you.
We'll take 1 or 2 online questions. The question is cooperation between China and US still possible in areas beyond their core interest? And if you have time and any of you would like to comment, the last online question is about rules and exceptionalism. Any difference in the way big powers apply international law or international rules, such as protecting civilians in different crises, for example, in the South China Sea, in Ukraine, in Middle East? We can try to stick to the maritime domain for the sake of. So I think try to be brief. Let's try to quickly have, I don't know who would like to start. Yeah, Dr. Wu.
I'll go first. Many questions. My Cambodia friend, you mentioned the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Just 2 months ago, China held the 75th anniversary for the peaceful coexistence was announced. So those principles are still important to deal with the relationship between countries. So with regard to, you just mentioned the COC, I think the problem now facing both in China and the Columbia states is we lack the mutual trust with regard to South China Sea. Or in other words, if we are talking about South China Sea, you don't trust me, I don't trust you. That's a problem. And also, Columbia states would like to use the window opportunity because the COC opportunity, consultation opportunity is going narrow. So those countries would like to, grasp the opportunity to consolidate their vested interests and jurisdictions. That's the main reason we are facing the challenges. The young leaders, young female from DAV, young leaders are great. You are talking about history. History is so complicated. I suggest, Ambassador Deng Jinghui and Ambassador Fan Lantong, we should organize another small workshop on the history of the South Chinese Sea, both from Vietnamese perspective and Chinese perspective. If we look at the Chinese argument with regards to it was China first discovered, named, and developed South Chinese Islands as early as in the 2nd century BC, before BC. So it's so complicated. I don't think we need to discuss this issue in this platform. And Kuomintang, Taipingdao, Ituaba. It is true, it was controlled or took over by then Kuomintang authority in 1956 when the Philippine navigator occupied illegally the Ituaba and then took over. If we look at the official stance held by Kuomintang authority, both in Maizhou or before Maizhou, the two sides of Taiwan Strait, with regard to China, South China Sea sovereignty and jurisdiction, we hold the same, official position. The DPP is another story. I don't want to talk this issue in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Grossman, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, I just want to say I feel a little bad for my Chinese colleague because I feel like we've all been kind of ganging up on China. But I will say that I attended Beijing Shangshan Forum last month, and I was the only American in the room sometimes, so I felt a little ganged up upon. So you see how this works, right? And it's really unfair, and it shouldn't be that way. And I just hope that both of our countries can, again, tone it down, as I had said, right? Because we all need to live on this beautiful earth, right? I mean, we see outside how beautiful it is here, right? And so nobody wants to see increased tension leading to crisis and war. And so what I said at Shangshan actually kind of answers the question about how to tone down the U.S.-China rivalry, which is we need to build more trust. We need to constantly discuss issues of core concern. And if we can't reach accommodation on those issues of core concern, well then find ways to make it so that the other country will trust you more on that core issue. I think a good example of this is, it kind of dates back a while now, 2014, when the US and China negotiated the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, or CUES, C-U-E-S. I don't know that that's necessarily being abided by these days, but it was an attempt to try to get the US and Chinese militaries, their navies in particular, right, to be more cautious in operating in the South China Sea so that there isn't miscalculation that could then lead to escalation and conflict, right? So those are the types of things that I would imagine we should be doing more of. And there's a question on the screen, is cooperation between China and the US still possible in areas outside their core interests? Absolutely, right? But the problem that we've seen in the last few years is that those areas of cooperation have been narrowing quite a bit, right? There still are some. We just saw when Xi and Biden met at APEC last November, they agreed to deal with the fentanyl issue, for example, right? So I still think there's hope for climate change, right? Not, if former President Trump gets elected again, then I'm not so sure we would have that opportunity, right? But I'm just saying there are some things that we can and we should be working on together. Non-proliferation, I think, is another good example. But again, those areas are narrowing, and we really have to strive, both of our countries, to keep that aperture open and preferably to expand that aperture of cooperation. And then I think I got a question about what to expect from the US in the South China Sea. To be honest, I don't think much hinges on this election at all when it comes to the US's position in the South China Sea, because as I mentioned in my remarks, if there's one area that Biden and Trump agreed upon, it was on Indo-Pacific strategy, right? And I think Kamala Harris hasn't spoken a whole lot about the Indo-Pacific, but the things that she has said make it clear that she is in line with Biden's approach and therefore, Trump's approach as well, as much as they may disagree on other issues. So I see us continuing to support this, free and open Indo-Pacific, primarily by enhancing alliances and partnerships in the region to counter China. But what I also want to see more of, and I think we're seeing this kind of in the tail end of the Biden administration, is reassurances to China that we're not going to go too far in what we're doing, right? And I don't know that there's been much reciprocation on Beijing's end, but at least we are trying to say that there are certain limits to our competition and our willingness to, militarize the situation in the South China Sea as well.
Thank you. Professor Devi.
Thank you. The questions about COC, why bother with it, and the ASEAN way, and also how do we reconcile ASEAN position of non-negotiable position of UNCLOS and the COC. Now, I think that the most important thing is, don't look at COC when we talk about legally binding. In the same way that we talk about the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation as being legally binding. It is a political document. It is not a legal document that has an enforcement mechanism. So for ASEAN, and I come back to when we talk about the ASEAN way, ASEAN is not in the business of resolving conflicts. The most important use for ASEAN is in diffusing conflict and in preventive diplomacy. We have an ambition to resolve conflicts, but we do not look at ASEAN as a multilateral institution, as a way of resolving conflicts. What we need from the Code of Conduct is to create an ecosystem where we develop trust with each other, where tensions are diffused, so that at a bilateral level, we can get on. Or sometimes we just sweep everything under the carpet. That is the ASEAN way. There are lots of dust under the carpet, but the fact of the matter is that the TAC has worked. Now, Professor Wu, if we go back to history, Indonesia used to have a huge empire. Sriwijaya, Majapahit, we used to claim Cambodia, the whole of the Malaysian peninsula. The Philippine Sulu sultans still claim Sabah and Sarawak. They still exist in their maps. So if we go back to history, Southeast Asian countries will still be fighting with each other. But in a lot of cases, we just go on with our business, we cooperate with each other. It's the political will. Do we put our differences as being more important, or do we put our peace and stability and prosperity as being more important? If we want to fight after every shoals and atolls and rocks, Indonesia and Malaysia will be still fighting over Ambalat. Every so often we still do. The most important thing I said is, when we talk about COC, whether we achieve it or not, don't look at it as a legally binding panacea where suddenly there'll be peace in the South China Sea. It depends on the political will. My question is, does China regard relations with Southeast Asia, with ASEAN, as important? Does China regard peace and stability in the South China Sea as important for all of us? If that is important, then we will restrain ourselves. And I think that is the spirit of the COC. Also, Derek, don't look at it as not solving problems. There's no enforcement mechanism in TAC. It is based on the political will of all of the sovereign governments of ASEAN that we are going to hold ourselves accountable. It's only peer pressure, shaming and naming. Do you want to be shamed and named at every conferences? And I think that is the question. Let's be very honest about it. And for ASEAN Way is in danger because you mentioned about some countries that do not have an immediate stake in the South China Sea maybe take a different position. And now I'd like to be very blunt. For our colleagues within ASEAN who do not have an immediate stakes in Southeast Asia, for God's sake, just show solidarity for those who do have a claim. If you cannot be constructive, just shut up. Do not say anything. Do not allow, there again, Ambassador Sosira, I'm being very un-ASEAN and very un-Indonesian here. We do not want to see what happened in 2012, where for the first time, ASEAN failed to come out with a joint communique. Let this be the one's black mark in ASEAN history and never to be repeated again. So ASEAN solidarity, ASEAN cohesion is extremely important. And the political will, again, So for China, for the United States, we do not want all this belligerent, just more threats against each other. With China, we have been living together for thousands of years. Whether United States gets interested or whether it gets disengaged, we will still have to live together. And I think that the question is whether we want to live continuously in trust or in distrust. Next year is the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. That's for the first time China was invited by Indonesia to attend the first Asian and African conference. That's where the spirit of peaceful coexistence happens. And I hope that we'll revive this again. So, I will say, UNCLOS and COC, how can we reconcile? International law is international law. Our territorial boundaries are determined by the archipelagic states. Indonesia was one of the countries that fought for the COC, for the UNCLOS 1982. As archipelagic states, for us, the questions about UNCLOS is not academic, it's existential. So we do not compromise on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think your claps say it all. I think it's a good note on which to finish that, building trust, toning down the rivalry or the competition, restraining, hopefully developing a code of conduct and mutual arrangements. I think they are very good things, messages to take back from this session. Thank you all very much. Thank you for the participation and thank you for the DAV for organizing this excellent session. Thank you.
Thank you, His Excellencies, once again, and thank you all of our distinguished speakers. Well, that was an exceptional session, and I know that there's still a lot of burning questions, but yeah, you can channel all your questions to our speaker during the lunch break, which will take place at the Bayleaf restaurant. And please do not use the main exit, but refer to the door on this side right here, and follow the organizers, follow our assistant team, who will be wearing dark blue polo t-shirt to the restaurant, which is the shortest way. Yeah. And I believe that is all the admin notes that I have for now. But don't forget also to bring your QR code. Bring your badge with the QR code with you to the lunch. And then our sessions, upcoming session 2, will be started at 1:30 sharp, so please reconvene at the conference room before 1:30. And for our online audience, thank you once again for sticking with us throughout the first 2 sessions. And don't forget to catch the live commentary sessions about session 1 and about the keynote sessions, which is moderated by our ambassador Nguyễn Đăng Dương, which is going to happen right now here on stage in Vietnamese. Cảm ơn quý vị đã theo dõi chương trình Hội thảo Biển Đông lần thứ 16. Quý vị có thể theo dõi phiên bình luận trực tiếp về phiên keynote, phiên khai mạc và phiên 1 của hội thảo được do đại sứ Nguyễn Nam Dương của Học viện Ngoại giao Viện Biển Đông điều phối. Phiên bình luận trực tiếp sẽ được diễn ra ngay trong ít phút nữa. Xin cảm ơn. Our delegate, please follow our organizers to the left side of the room. I mean, to my left side of the room. To get to the restaurant, yes, this way. Follow the people wearing the organizer board badge. Don't forget to carry your badge. Carry your QR code with you. Sophia, have you got your badge yet? Anh ơi đủ quấy. Our first live commentary moderated by Ambassador Nguyễn Nam Dương will be starting in a few minutes here, and this live commentary will be in Vietnamese. Vâng, là mọi người sẽ tự đi lên.
Chương trình của mình là bóng đá. Quên, đi lấy cái được hội viên chỉ đạo là
nếu sắp xếp theo ban chức là cái này anh nữa.
đây là khu khán giả domestic ạ.
Xin chào quý vị đại biểu, xin chào quý vị khán giả của Hội thảo Biển Đông lần thứ 16, và bây giờ sẽ là phiên bình luận trực tiếp đầu tiên về các phiên keynote, phiên khai mạc và phiên số 1 do Đại sứ Nguyễn Nam Dương dẫn dắt. Xin mời đại sứ.
Vâng, kính thưa quý vị và các bạn, Học viện Ngoại giao xin kính mời quý vị và các bạn tiếp tục theo dõi phiên bình luận thứ nhất của Hội thảo quốc tế về Biển Đông lần thứ 16. Sáng nay thì quý vị và các bạn vừa mới theo dõi xong phiên khai mạc và phiên 1 của Hội thảo khoa học quốc tế về Biển Đông lần thứ 16. Hội thảo năm nay thì được Học viện Ngoại giao tổ chức tại thành phố Hạ Long với chủ đề định hướng tư duy, phát huy chuẩn mực. Phiên 1 của chúng ta vừa mới kết thúc thì có cái nội dung là sự quá độ tới một thế giới đa cực, chiến tranh lạnh, hòa bình nóng hay cùng tồn tại hòa bình. Và để giúp quý vị và các bạn hiểu rõ về các nội dung trên đây, cũng như tìm hiểu về những ý kiến và quan điểm của học giả Việt Nam về các nội dung này, Học viện Ngoại giao đã mời lên sân khấu Giáo sư tiến sĩ Nguyễn Vũ Tùng, nguyên Giám đốc Học viện Ngoại giao, Phó giáo sư tiến sĩ Hà Anh Tuấn, trưởng khoa Chính trị quốc tế và Ngoại giao Việt Nam, Học viện Ngoại giao, và Phó giáo sư tiến sĩ Phạm Minh Sơn, Giám đốc Học viện Báo chí và Tuyên truyền. Xin chân thành cảm ơn các ông đã nhận lời tham dự phiên bình luận thứ nhất ngày hôm nay. Tôi xin hỏi các ông câu hỏi thứ nhất như sau. Các ông quan tâm, chú ý nhất đến nội dung nào sau khi nghe các bài phát biểu và thảo luận trong buổi sáng nay? Và xin mời ông Tùng.
Xin cảm ơn Đại sứ Nam Dương đã cho chúng tôi cơ hội để được chia sẻ những cái nhận xét và những cái suy nghĩ của mình về cái phiên đầu tiên này. Thì trước tiên thì tôi cũng xin chia sẻ cái ý nghĩa ban đầu là đây chúng ta đều biết là cái hội thảo quốc tế về Biển Đông đã là lần thứ 16, tức là chúng ta đã có hơn, ta gọi là 1 thập kỷ rưỡi để bàn về câu chuyện Biển Đông này. Cho nên là chúng ta sẽ thấy rằng là cái việc thường xuyên phải thảo luận về vấn đề Biển Đông đó là cũng thể hiện một cái sự bức xúc của chúng ta về những cái tình hình diễn biến ở trên Biển Đông, những cái quan điểm của các bên liên quan cũng như là những tìm tòi và đánh giá của giới học giả về các cái vấn đề liên quan đến Biển Đông. Và cho nên là với một người mà đã từng tham gia nhiều cái hội thảo Biển Đông này thì bao giờ cá nhân tôi cũng đi tìm xem là có những cái điểm gì lặp lại của những cái hội nghị trước và có những điểm gì mới của hội nghị lần này. Và cho nên là tôi thấy rằng là có cái phiên đầu qua các cái lời phát biểu mở đầu cũng như là phiên 1 thì đã có những cái cập nhật rất là tốt về tình hình diễn biến trên Biển Đông sau kể từ hội nghị trước cho đến hội nghị này, và tôi thấy các sự cập nhật rất là chính xác và rất là thể hiện đúng cái sự quan tâm của mọi người liên quan đến Biển Đông.
Dạ vâng, xin mời ông Hà Anh Tuấn ạ.
Vâng, xin cảm ơn Đại sứ Nguyễn Nam Dương. Cá nhân tôi thì cũng như là Đại sứ Nguyễn Vũ Tùng là cũng đã được tham dự rất là nhiều cái kỳ họp hội thảo của Biển Đông trong các năm vừa rồi. Nhưng mà tôi cũng có một cái khác biệt nữa là sau một vài năm đi công tác thì lần này mới được lại quay trở lại. Thì tôi thấy là cái phiên buổi sáng ngày hôm nay với 3 cái phiên riêng rẽ, một là cái phiên khai mạc, hai là cái phiên mở đầu và 3 là cái phiên thứ nhất, đã bao gồm rất là nhiều những cái bài bình luận và thông tin rất là có giá trị và hữu ích. Thì tôi nhận thấy là cũng rất là chia sẻ với ý kiến của giáo sư Nguyễn Vũ Tùng là cái sự tìm tòi của của giới học giả thì là cái đấy là cái công việc khoa học. Và cá nhân tôi thấy là trong những cái thảo luận khoa học ấy, nó mà có càng nhiều những cái điểm dẫn đến những cái tranh luận, dẫn đến những cái nội dung để cho chúng ta thảo luận với nhau thì nó sẽ là những cái nhân tố rất là phù hợp cho những cái phiên thảo luận tiếp theo trong chiều ngày hôm nay cũng như cả ngày mai. Và buổi sáng ngày hôm nay thì mặc dù là chúng ta đặt ra cái tông giọng tổng thể của một cái sự kiện như thế này, chúng ta mong muốn thúc đẩy cái hòa bình, ổn định và hợp tác ở trên Biển Đông, nhưng mà các học giả ngày hôm nay cũng đã nêu ra được những cái thách thức, những cái vấn đề mà các nước trong khu vực cần phải giải quyết và để thúc đẩy hợp tác trong thời gian tới.
Xin cảm ơn. Xin mời ông Phạm Minh Sơn.
Vâng, xin cảm ơn Đại sứ Nguyễn Nam Dương đã mời lên bình luận về vấn đề này. Trước hết là tôi nhận thấy các bài phát biểu trong cái hội thảo hôm nay ấy, mặc dù đây là hội thảo lần thứ 16 nhưng mà các vấn đề vẫn còn rất là nóng bỏng. Và các học giả hôm nay cũng như là các bài phát biểu hôm nay đã đề cập đến nhiều các cái nội dung rất là hay, hấp dẫn và gợi mở nhiều vấn đề cần bàn luận và suy nghĩ. Và qua các ý kiến được phát biểu thì tôi thì không đề cập đến một cái tác giả nào một tác giả nào nổi trội hơn, nhưng mà tôi đề cập tới một cái vấn đề mà được nhiều các tác giả đề cập đến. Và trong cái buổi hôm nay ấy, sáng nay chúng ta thấy nổi lên đó là cái tác động của cái cục diện thế giới đa cực đến cái khu vực Biển Đông hiện nay. Và gần như là các bài phát biểu trong buổi sáng nay ít nhiều để đề cập đến các vấn đề này. Ví dụ như là của bà Catherine West, hoặc của ông Tim Watts, ông Nicholas Kawastrom, hoặc là đặc biệt là trong cái phiên thảo luận thứ nhất của cái hội thảo hôm nay, các bài phát biểu của tiến sĩ Ngô Sĩ Tồn cũng gợi mở rất nhiều vấn đề mà cần phải tranh luận. Tôi nghĩ là vấn đề đấy, đặc biệt là khi ông nói về những vấn đề về lưỡi bò hoặc là về COC, tôi nghĩ là đấy là những vấn đề mà cần phải tranh luận rất là nhiều đối với lại học giả. Bên cạnh đó thì tôi cũng đánh giá rất là cao cái bài phát biểu của ông Derek Grossman và đặc biệt là của giáo sư Daily Fortuna ở Ân Quốc đã nêu lên những cái quan điểm mà tôi nghĩ là sẽ được rất nhiều các cái học giả cũng như các cái ý kiến phát biểu chia sẻ trong cái buổi sáng này. Để có thể chúng ta nhận thấy là cái trật tự quốc tế đang chuyển dần sang cái đa cực, và những cái tác động của cục diện thế giới này nó đang tác động rất là mạnh mẽ đến cái khu vực Biển Đông của chúng ta. Và cụ thể đó là cái cạnh tranh về tầm nhìn cũng như là các quy tắc quản trị quốc tế của các cường quốc đang ảnh hưởng trực tiếp đến các vấn đề tranh chấp lãnh thổ, những vấn đề an ninh hàng hải, rồi là những vấn đề về Biển Đông. Với cái vai trò của các cường quốc bên ngoài khu vực như là Mỹ, như là Ấn Độ, như là EU, như Australia, như Trung Quốc hoặc Nga đang tác động ngày càng lớn và ảnh hưởng đến trực tiếp đến cái sự duy trì ổn định cũng như là về việc những cái vấn đề tác động đến Biển Đông của chúng ta. Cảm ơn.
Xin chân thành cảm ơn ông. Tôi xin phép hỏi các ông câu hỏi thứ hai. Các ông có bình luận gì về chủ đề của hội thảo Biển Đông năm nay? Đó là định hướng tư duy, phát huy chuẩn mực. Tôi xin mời ông Hà Anh Tuấn trước.
Vâng, xin cảm ơn đại sứ Nguyễn Nam Dương. Cá nhân tôi thì tôi nhìn thấy cái bản thân cái tên của cái hội thảo lần này nó đã thể hiện cái tính xây dựng và vừa có cái tính kiến tạo ở trong đó. Từ cái tên nó rất là quan trọng trong một cái bối cảnh trật tự mới như Thứ trưởng Bộ Ngoại giao Đỗ Hùng Việt đã phát biểu, là cái thế giới, trật tự thế giới của chúng ta hiện nay đang trong cái giai đoạn định hình, và với cái chủ đề này thì chúng ta đóng góp không chỉ cho cái trật tự thế giới ở trên Biển Đông mà nó ở cái quy mô rộng hơn. Cái hội thảo Biển Đông này nó còn góp phần kiến tạo ra một cái trật tự của khu vực cũng như là thế giới với những cái giá trị tốt đẹp và phù hợp hơn. Thế nhưng mà chúng ta cũng như là đại sứ Phạm Văn Dung, giám đốc Học viện Ngoại giao nói, thì cái chuỗi hội thảo này nó cũng đóng cái vai trò gọi là hỗ trợ cái tiến trình để xây dựng hòa bình và thúc đẩy hợp tác một cách từ từ, cũng như là các đại biểu trong cái phiên buổi sáng hôm nay nói về cái hợp tác trong ASEAN, thì ASEAN sẽ có những cái đóng góp từ từ. Chúng ta không thể kỳ vọng có thể mọi việc tốt đẹp có thể xảy ra được ngay trong gọi là, nếu mà trong tiếng Anh là overnight, thì nó không thể xảy ra nhanh chóng được. Thì chúng ta cũng hy vọng là với những cái tiến trình như là cái chuỗi hội thảo Biển Đông này và các cái tiến trình trong ASEAN cũng như là các cái sự kiện khác, chúng ta cùng nhau để xây dựng ra một cái trật tự khu vực và thế giới hòa bình và hợp tác hơn ạ.
Vâng, xin cảm ơn ông Tuấn ạ. Tôi xin mời ông Tùng ạ.
Tôi xin nhận xét ý kiến cá nhân của tôi thế này. Qua cái phiên đầu, phiên khai mạc cũng như là phiên 1 thì tất cả các đại biểu đều nhận thức được rằng, một là tình hình Biển Đông ngày càng trở nên phức tạp hơn và có những diễn biến thậm chí theo hướng căng thẳng hơn. Thứ hai là các cái nỗ lực để giải quyết tình hình, giảm bớt sự căng thẳng, sự phức tạp của tình hình cho đến nay về cơ bản vẫn chưa có kết quả, vẫn chưa được như mong muốn. Và thứ ba là các cái giải pháp cũng chưa được các giải pháp mới cũng chưa được định hình rõ ràng. Và chốt lại là cái sự lo ngại về sự căng thẳng và những cái tác động xấu đến hòa bình, ổn định khu vực và hợp tác trong khu vực nó tăng lên. Thì đấy là những cái tôi nghĩ rằng là có thể nhận ra được, mọi người có thể nhất trí. Nhưng mà nếu mà đi cùng với cái chủ đề về những cái narratives thì rõ ràng là có sự khác biệt rất lớn về nguyên nhân của tình hình, về sự khác biệt về các giải pháp từ các nhận định tình hình đó. Thì cho nên là cái chủ đề nó rất là thích hợp để cho mình hình dung ra rằng là mọi người tiếp cận các vấn đề này nó giống nhau và khác nhau chỗ nào, và mọi người hình dung ra các cái giải pháp như thế nào. Thì tôi cũng có một cái nhận xét thứ hai rằng là ở đây rõ ràng là có sự phân tuyến về các cái narratives, và một bên là Trung Quốc và một bên là các đại biểu từ các phần còn lại ở khu vực. Thì rõ ràng là Trung Quốc, các đại biểu Trung Quốc đã đưa ra một cái narratives, và nó ở đây là khoa học cho nên mình chưa nói đúng sai vội, nhưng mà ít nhất là các cái narratives mà các đại biểu Trung Quốc đưa ra là nó không giống với những các narratives mà các đại biểu khác đưa ra. Thế và chỗ này là như tiến sĩ Hà Anh Tuấn nói là chỗ để chúng ta thảo luận, và chính vì thế mà cái ý nghĩa của cái hội thảo nó tiếp tục như thế, và cái cách điểm nhấn về narratives tôi thấy là rất là sáng tạo của ban tổ chức.
Vâng, xin mời ý kiến của ông Phạm Minh Sơn ạ.
Vâng, về cá nhân tôi thì tôi nhận thấy rằng là ban tổ chức lựa chọn cái chủ đề về định hướng tư duy và phát huy chuẩn mực là tôi thấy rất là phù hợp. Vấn đề số chúng ta thấy rằng là các cái chủ đề hội thảo này ấy, nó rất là có ý nghĩa trong cái bối cảnh hiện nay, khi mà cái bối cảnh cạnh tranh, nhất là tranh chấp lãnh thổ và các hoạt động quân sự hóa nó ngày càng gia tăng ở trong khu vực. Nó đòi hỏi một cách tiếp cận nó phải sâu sắc hơn để giải quyết vấn đề, và nhất là yêu cầu đặt ra phải duy trì về trật tự quốc tế dựa trên luật pháp. Về định hướng tư duy ấy, thì ở đây chúng tôi thấy là ban tổ chức đã nhấn mạnh đến cái việc phải xây dựng một cách nhìn nhận nó toàn diện và công bằng về các vấn đề có liên quan đến Biển Đông. Và qua các cái tranh luận hôm nay chúng ta thấy là tưởng chừng như vấn đề này, mặc dù đây là năm thứ 16 rồi, nhưng mà cái vấn đề gốc gác là từ cái nhận thức của các bên, của các nước thì nó vẫn chưa được cái thống nhất. Và trong bối cảnh mà cái trật tự thế giới đang có cái sự chuyển biến như này, thì chúng ta lại một lần nữa nhìn nhận cái vấn đề này từ gốc rễ của nó, từ cái nhận thức của các bên, của các nước về vấn đề này. Và bây giờ cần phải định hướng cái tư duy này cho nó phù hợp với cái bối cảnh mới. Và tôi nghĩ cái chủ đề và định hướng tư duy là nó rất là cần thiết trong bối cảnh này. Và cái thứ hai là phát huy chuẩn mực ấy, thì nó đề cập đến những cái tiêu chuẩn, nó đề cập đến những quy tắc trong quan hệ quốc tế mà chúng ta phải dựa vào đó để có thể giải quyết được vấn đề. Đặc biệt trong buổi hôm nay mọi người đề cập rất nhiều đến những cái công ước của Liên Hợp Quốc về luật biển UNCLOS, và nhất là về những vấn đề của DOC, COC ở khu vực Biển Đông chúng ta. Và tôi nghĩ đây cũng là một cái vấn đề căn cốt, một cái chỗ dựa để chúng ta có thể giải quyết các vấn đề của Biển Đông. Do vậy tôi thấy là việc lựa chọn cái chủ đề của hội thảo hôm nay là rất là phù hợp, nó đáp ứng cái yêu cầu hiện nay của cái tình hình Biển Đông hiện nay.
Vâng, xin cảm ơn ý kiến của ông Sơn ạ. Tôi xin phép hỏi các ông một câu hỏi cuối cùng. Trong phiên gần đây nhất thì các đại biểu đã thảo luận về một thế giới đa cực. Đấy, vậy theo các ông, làm thế nào để ASEAN có thể phát huy được vai trò của mình trước cái cục diện khu vực hiện nay? Tôi xin phép được bắt đầu với ông Phạm Minh Sơn ạ.
Vâng, đây là câu hỏi rất là hay nhưng mà cũng rất là khó trong cái bối cảnh này, khi mà cái trật tự thế giới đang chuyển sang đa cực và cái cạnh tranh trong quan hệ quốc tế nó ngày càng lớn. Thì theo quan điểm của tôi ấy, để phát huy cái vai trò của mình trong cái cục diện khu vực hiện nay thì ASEAN phải thực hiện một loạt các cái biện pháp. Trước hết và cái quan trọng nhất đó là phải tăng cường cái đoàn kết nội khối. Cái trật tự thế giới mà nó, và đặc biệt là bối cảnh quốc tế nó càng nóng ấy, thì lại càng đòi hỏi cái sự đoàn kết trong bản thân nội khối của ASEAN. Và cái cơ sở của cái đoàn kết nội khối này theo tôi nghĩ đó chính là cái việc chia sẻ các cái lợi ích, chia sẻ cái giá trị, chia sẻ cái cách nhìn, tầm nhìn của các nước trong ASEAN. Cái thứ hai ấy, là ASEAN cũng phải tăng cường hơn nữa vai trò trong cái trung gian trong các cái giải quyết các vấn đề quốc tế, trong đó có đặc biệt là những vấn đề trong cái khu vực Biển Đông, trực tiếp liên quan đến Biển Đông, trong cái mối quan hệ với các nước lớn như là Trung Quốc, như là Mỹ, rồi là EU, rồi các nước có liên quan. Thứ ba nữa là chúng ta phải tiếp tục phải củng cố luật pháp quốc tế và thúc đẩy tuân thủ các cái quy định, các cái luật pháp quốc tế, nhất là tuân thủ UNCLOS cũng như là bộ quy tắc ứng xử trên Biển Đông để làm cái cơ sở pháp lý cho các cái hoạt động hợp tác. Một cái điểm nữa tôi nghĩ là ASEAN cũng cần phải tiến hành trong thời gian sắp tới, đó là thúc đẩy hợp tác kinh tế và phát triển bền vững trong khu vực. Đây chính là một cái giá trị chia sẻ về lợi ích rất là quan trọng giữa các nước ASEAN. Cũng là cái cơ sở để các nước có thống nhất với nhau và có xây dựng được cái sự đoàn kết với nhau. Và cũng cần phải phát triển cái cơ chế ứng phó với khủng hoảng trong cái bối cảnh nếu như mà tình hình nó ngày càng diễn ra phức tạp hoặc là nó nóng lên nữa, thì chúng ta phải có cơ chế để giảm bớt các cái khả năng có thể xảy ra các xung đột, giải quyết các khủng hoảng. Và cuối cùng là ASEAN cũng phải tiếp tục phát huy vai trò trong cái mối quan hệ với các cường quốc ở trong khu vực cũng như là ngoài khu vực để cùng nhau giải quyết vấn đề Biển Đông.
Vâng, xin cảm ơn ý kiến của ông Sơn. Xin mời ý kiến của ông Hà Anh Tuấn ạ.
Dạ, xin cảm ơn ạ. Cá nhân tôi thì cũng chia sẻ ý kiến của người phát biểu trước. Thực ra là ASEAN đã thành lập và tồn tại cho đến nay được gần 60 năm rồi, và bản thân cái lịch sử nó sẽ có cái giá trị của nó. Bản thân cái sự tồn tại của ASEAN trong suốt 60 năm vừa rồi đã cho thấy cái giá trị và cái lý do tại sao nó tồn tại được như vậy. Vào cái thời điểm hiện nay nó cũng không phải là cái thời điểm thực sự là khó khăn nhất đối với cái quá trình hình thành và phát triển của ASEAN đâu. ASEAN đã trải qua những cái giai đoạn còn khó khăn hơn rất là nhiều, khi mà xung đột vào khu vực nó chia rẽ cái khu vực Đông Nam Á này, khi mà chiến tranh lạnh sụp đổ, rồi là khi mà những cái tư tưởng hiện thực nó còn rất là mạnh ở Đông Nam Á thì ASEAN cũng vẫn vượt qua. Do vậy là trong cái buổi ngày hôm nay chúng ta cũng thấy là có rất là nhiều các đại biểu đến từ các nước Đông Nam Á và cả các nước ngoài Đông Nam Á, từ Indonesia, từ Malaysia, từ Campuchia, từ cả các nước ngoài khu vực, là những người mà đã có nghiên cứu rất là sâu về ASEAN và cũng có những cái kết luận rằng là chúng ta nhìn thấy cái vai trò của ASEAN trong cái việc quản lý các cái tranh chấp ở khu vực, nhưng cũng không nên quá kỳ vọng. Chúng ta cần phải hiểu được cái vai trò, cái vị trí của ASEAN và không nên quá kỳ vọng vào cái việc ASEAN có thể đóng góp giải quyết xung đột, mà ASEAN trong suốt cái quá trình hình thành và phát triển của mình vẫn tập trung chủ yếu nhiều hơn vào cái việc giúp quản lý các cái tranh chấp và xung đột và thúc đẩy cái hợp tác đối thoại giữa các cái bên liên quan. Đặc biệt tôi rất là tâm đắc với những bài phát biểu của giáo sư Dewi Anwar của Trung tâm Habibie của Indonesia, và rất nhấn mạnh vào cái ý nghĩa, cái vai trò của ASEAN. Và tôi chia sẻ những cái ý kiến của người phát biểu trước, đấy là để thúc đẩy thêm cái vai trò của ASEAN trong khu vực, có lẽ là chúng ta cần tiếp tục tăng cường cái giá trị đoàn kết của nội khối, và đặc biệt là trong những cái lĩnh vực mới, thì để từ đấy nó sẽ tạo ra cái động lực để thúc đẩy hợp tác ASEAN trong những lĩnh vực rộng hơn, cũng như là thúc đẩy hợp tác giữa ASEAN và các đối tác bên ngoài.
Xin cảm ơn ông Tuấn ạ. Xin mời ý kiến của ông Nguyễn Vũ Tùng ạ.
Tôi thấy lại quay trở lại cái chủ đề của hội thảo là định hướng về tư duy, thì chúng ta đang gặp phải một cái tình trạng không chỉ ở trong phòng hội thảo này mà phía ngoài, quan hệ quốc tế của khu vực và rộng hơn liên quan đến vấn đề Biển Đông là nó có sự hỗn loạn hoặc sự gọi là tranh chấp nhau về giữa các narratives. Và chính vì thế mà nếu mà những người nào hoặc là theo dõi không đầy đủ, hoặc là những người nào mà có những cái lồng ghép những cái lợi ích có tính chất cục bộ vào, thì nó sẽ dẫn đến tình trạng là nó sẽ không tranh luận, không có hồi kết. Cho nên là nếu mà mình gắn với cái gọi là chủ đề cũng như là cái tư duy về định hướng tư duy, thì tôi thấy ít nhất là qua hai cái phiên đầu tôi thấy đã hình thành ở một mức độ tương đối là có thể thấy được là chúng ta phải định cái tư duy của chúng ta về vấn đề Biển Đông này theo 3 góc độ. Góc độ thứ nhất là phải dựa vào luật pháp. Chúng ta có hệ thống các nguyên tắc luật pháp quốc tế. Chúng ta cụ thể hơn, chúng ta có luật biển UNCLOS năm 1982. Và đây là một cái rõ ràng là chúng ta phải định hướng tư duy theo cái đó. Tất cả những hành động nào mà tuân theo luật pháp, tuân thủ luật pháp thì đấy là hành động đúng. Và những hành động nào mà bóp méo luật pháp và không tuân thủ luật pháp thì đấy hành động không đúng. Thì chúng ta định hướng là phải định hướng theo hướng đó. Cái thứ hai là chúng ta phải định hướng theo cái vai trò trung tâm của ASEAN, là bởi vì là ASEAN là nơi cho đến hiện nay vẫn là một cái diễn đàn khu vực được nhiều người chấp nhận, được tất cả các nước chấp nhận về cái vai trò trung tâm của nó, và những cái nguyên tắc, những cái tiêu chuẩn hành vi mà ASEAN hỗ trợ cũng phải là những căn cứ để mình xem là các hành vi của các nước liên quan đến tranh chấp Biển Đông nó có đúng hay không. Và cái tiến trình cụ thể của ASEAN đang theo đuổi cùng các nước khác là COC và DOC thì cũng cần phải được xem là mọi người có tuân thủ đúng cái COC và DOC không. Thì đấy là cái ý thứ hai là liên quan đến định hướng về tư duy, để trên cơ sở đó mình có căn cứ để phán xét các hành động cụ thể ngoài thực địa. Và cái định hướng thứ ba là phải coi trọng ý kiến của các nước vừa và các nước nhỏ, bởi mặc dù có thể là có can dự vào Biển Đông hay không, nhưng mà các nước vừa và nhỏ trong ASEAN, ví dụ như là ý kiến của Indonesia là nước không liên quan trực tiếp đến tranh chấp Biển Đông, hoặc là các nước khác như là Úc, như là EU, như là Anh mà có các đại biểu đến tham dự hội thảo này, thì chúng ta hình dung ra rằng luật pháp quốc tế, cơ chế của ASEAN cũng quan trọng, nhưng mà ý kiến của các nước vừa và nhỏ cũng rất là quan trọng, là bởi vì luật pháp về cơ bản là bảo vệ các nước vừa và nhỏ, để tránh cho các nước vừa và nhỏ bị lôi kéo vào hoặc là bị lấn át bởi các nước lớn và cạnh tranh giữa các nước lớn. Thì tôi nghĩ rằng là ba cái hướng đó là tôi nghĩ rất quan trọng cho việc định hướng tư duy nói chung, cũng như là theo dõi các cái phát biểu ý kiến và các tranh luận tại hội thảo lần này và các hội thảo lần sau.
Xin cảm ơn ý kiến của ông Tùng ạ. Và một lần nữa tôi xin chân thành cảm ơn ý kiến của tất cả các ông, và cảm ơn các ông đã tham gia cái phiên bình luận ngày hôm nay. Xin mời quý vị và các bạn chúng ta tiếp tục theo dõi các phiên buổi chiều của hội thảo quốc tế về Biển Đông lần thứ 16. Chân thành cảm ơn. Cảm ơn anh nhé. Cảm ơn anh Sơn ạ.
Chắc là ra chưa được đâu.
Ăn chưa ạ? Hơi muộn một chút đấy. Xuất sắc. Hội thảo nó sáng bừng lên.